I was 16 when my dad remarried Karen, and at first, she seemed nice enough. She was all smiles, wearing these stylish dresses and making everyone laugh at family dinners. But looking back, I can see now that the friendliness was just a mask, a way to get her foot in the door. It wasn't long before her true colors began to show. At first, it was little things, small comments that seemed innocent but landed with a sting. Maya, you missed a spot dusting. Or didn't your mother ever teach you to fold laundry properly? I thought she was just trying to help or show me how she liked things done. But the comments piled up quickly, and I realized there was no end to them. It felt like no matter what I did, it was wrong. One day after school, I came home and found Karen had reorganized my room. My books and notebooks were in different places. My clothes were folded, but not the way I'd done it. She was sitting on my bed, flipping through my sketchbook as if she owned it. "Oh, Maya," she said with a smirk. "You're so creative. But shouldn't you be focusing on something a bit more productive?" I stood there in the doorway, heart pounding. My sketches were private, just for me, and she'd gone through them like they were nothing. But what could I say? She was technically my stepmother now. I forced myself to smile and muttered something polite before grabbing my things and locking myself in the bathroom to calm down. After that day, the rules around the house seemed to tighten. Karen had a way of making demands sound like suggestions, always with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I was suddenly responsible for things that I hadn't been before, vacuuming the living room, cleaning the bathrooms, even cooking dinner sometimes. Karen said it was to teach me responsibility, but I knew better. It was her way of putting me in my place. Dad? He didn't seem to notice any of it. He'd nod along when Karen talked about helping me grow up and preparing me for the real world. He never asked if I was okay with it. The worst part was that whenever he was around, Karen would act so different. She'd laugh, make jokes, even ask me how school was going in this overly sweet voice. But as soon as he was gone, her smile would vanish, and she'd find some new chore for me to do. The isolation started soon after. Karen didn't like my friends. "They're a bad influence, Maya," she'd say, shaking her head like she knew them better than I did. Little by little, she discouraged me from inviting them over, finding excuses or making sure I was too busy with chores to see them. My friends stopped calling after a while, and I stopped asking to go out. It was easier that way, less conflict. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, after a long day of school and cleaning up around the house, I was exhausted and barely picked at dinner. Karen noticed, of course. She always noticed. "Not hungry?" she asked with a raised eyebrow, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or are you just being ungrateful again?" I forced myself to eat a few bites, but it felt like swallowing rocks. My dad was right there, and he just kept eating as if he hadn't heard her. I glanced at him, hoping he'd say something, but he was staring down at his plate. I wanted to scream, to tell him to notice what was happening right in front of him. But instead, I kept quiet just like I always did. Then came the day that changed everything. Karen called a family meeting one evening, insisting that we all gather in the living room. My dad looked confused, but he went along with it. I sat on the edge of the couch, already dreading whatever she was about to say. "We have big news," she announced, flashing her teeth in that fake smile. "I'm pregnant." My dad looked thrilled, pulling her into a hug while she feigned surprise, as if she hadn't orchestrated this whole announcement. I sat there, forcing a smile, but all I felt was a sinking feeling in my stomach. A new baby. I didn't know what that would mean for me, but I had a horrible suspicion it wouldn't be good. Karen made it clear over the next few weeks that her pregnancy meant big changes for the family, specifically for me. She started calling me practice for when the baby came, assigning me more and more tasks to help out. Suddenly, I was responsible for preparing meals, doing laundry, cleaning every corner of the house. I was practically running the household while Karen lounged around, resting because she was eating for two now. She'd watch me as I cleaned, making little comments here and there. "That's not how I would have done it, but I guess it's good enough," she'd say with a dismissive wave. Or, "Maya, you're slacking. Do you want the baby to grow up in a messy house?" The baby became her excuse for everything. If I ever dared to complain or even look upset, she'd say, Don't stress me out, Maya. I'm doing this for the baby. My dad just seemed to go along with it, nodding and smiling whenever Karen mentioned how much help I was being. The worst part was, she knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I couldn't complain without seeming ungrateful or selfish. She'd found a way to trap me, and I felt helpless, caught in this game where she made the rules and I was just a pawn. One evening, after I'd finally finished cleaning the kitchen, I overheard Karen talking to my dad in the living room. I froze just outside the doorway, listening as she told him, "You know, it's probably best for everyone if Maya starts thinking about moving out. She's old enough to take care of herself, and it's not healthy for the baby to be around, well, that kind of attitude." My heart raced as I listened, barely able to breathe. My dad mumbled something, but I couldn't make out his response. I just stood there, stunned, realizing what this all meant. Karen was planning to push me out, to get rid of me as soon as she had her own real family. I backed away quietly, not wanting them to know I'd heard. My mind was spinning. Where would I go? I didn't have any family nearby, and I couldn't rely on my friends after all this time apart. The thought of being completely alone terrified me, but I knew Karen wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. She'd do whatever it took to make sure I was gone. As I lay in bed that night, I tried to think of a plan, some way to protect myself. But the more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. Every day after that, I walked around with a weight in my chest, like a ticking clock counting down to the moment Karen would finally throw me out. Each time I came home, I expected to find my things packed up by the door. I went about my chores quietly, trying to stay under her radar, hoping that if I kept my head down, she might ease up. But things only got worse. Karen didn't stop with her endless chores and criticisms. She'd added new rules, restrictions that made me feel like I was living in some twisted version of a prison. She'd confiscated my phone for the baby's safety since she didn't want unnecessary distractions in the house. That phone was my only connection to the world outside these walls, my only link to anyone who cared about me. I tried asking her for it back, explaining that I needed it for school, but she just laughed, saying if I wanted it, I'd have to prove I could be responsible. Her definition of responsible meant running every errand, cleaning every room, and making every meal. There wasn't a second to myself. I was too exhausted to think, much less plan. And every time I tried to talk to my dad, hoping he'd see through her lies, he'd just shrug and mumble about keeping the peace. One day, as I was scrubbing the bathroom tiles, Karen appeared in the doorway, arms crossed and a smug smile on her face. "Maya, you missed a spot," she said, pointing at a barely noticeable streak on the mirror. I was on my knees, already covered in cleaning solution, my arms aching, and I wanted to scream. But I bit my tongue, wiped the mirror again, and moved on. This became our routine. She'd find fault in everything I did, no matter how hard I tried. And each time, her words dug deeper, leaving scars I couldn't see, but felt every day. She'd tell me I was ungrateful, a burden, that I was lucky she hadn't kicked me out already. I started to believe her, started to wonder if maybe I really was the problem. Maybe I didn't deserve to be here. And then there was Chloe. Chloe had always been her perfect little princess, and now, with the baby on the way, she'd become Karen's little accomplice. I could see her watching me with the same judgmental look. Karen wore, mimicking her mother's sneers and whispers. If I made a mistake, Chloe was the first to run and tell Karen, and she'd stand by, smirking, as I got scolded. I didn't recognize her anymore. It was as if Karen had molded her into a younger version of herself. But I couldn't blame Chloe. She was just a kid, and in a way, she was as much under Karen's control as I was. Still, it hurt to see how quickly she'd turned against me, how easily she'd become another tool Karen could use to make my life miserable. The isolation became unbearable. My friends had all but forgotten about me, and with my phone gone, I had no way of reaching out to them. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. She cut me off from everyone, and now I had nowhere to turn. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, Karen walked into the kitchen, looking more smug than usual. She leaned against the counter, watching me chop vegetables, and said, "You know, Maya, It might be time for you to start looking for somewhere else to live. I froze, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering onto the cutting board. She was finally saying it out loud, what she'd been hinting at for weeks. I looked at her, my heart pounding. What do you mean? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Well, she said, tilting her head and feigning concern. With the baby coming, things are going to get cramped around here. I just think it's time you took responsibility for your own life, don't you? I couldn't breathe. She was really going to do it. She was going to throw me out of my own home. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Karen shrugged, a wicked smile spreading across her face. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're resourceful, aren't you? That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. I had no money, no job, nowhere to go. The reality of my situation crashed down on me, and for the first time, I let myself cry. I cried for everything I'd lost, for the family I'd never really had, for the life Karen had stolen from me. In the days that followed, Karen's plan became painfully clear. She ramped up the chores, the demands, making me so exhausted that I didn't have the energy to resist. She knew that if she kept me worn down, I'd have no choice but to leave when she finally pushed me out. She even started talking to my dad about finding a nice place for Maya, as if she were doing me a favor, as if she cared at all about where I ended up. I tried one last time to talk to my dad, to make him see what was happening. I waited until Karen was out running errands, cornering him in the living room. Dad, you have to see what she's doing to me, I pleaded. She's trying to get rid of me. She wants me gone. He looked at me, his eyes tired and distant, and sighed. Maya, I know things have been tough, but Karen's just trying to keep the family together. You're almost an adult. Maybe it's time you started thinking about what's next for you. His words felt like a slap in the face. He wasn't going to help me. He wasn't going to stand up for me. He'd chosen her, and he was willing to let her throw me away if it meant keeping her happy. That night, I started packing. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. It hurt more than anything I'd ever felt, the betrayal, the abandonment, but I forced myself to keep going. I stuffed my clothes into a backpack, grabbed the few personal items Karen hadn't taken from me, and left without saying goodbye. As I walked away from the house, the cold night air biting at my skin, I felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. I was finally free from Karen, from her control, her cruelty. But I was also alone, completely and utterly alone. I had no idea what would happen next, no plan, no safety net. But I kept walking, refusing to look back, determined to prove that I could survive, even if no one believed in me. I walked through the streets with nowhere to go, feeling a strange emptiness where panic should have been. The night was cold, and I hugged my backpack close, each step feeling heavier than the last. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I couldn't think about that yet. For now, all I could focus on was finding somewhere safe for the night. I remembered my friend Sam lived nearby. We hadn't talked much lately. Karen had seen to that, but Sam had always been there for me in the past. I figured it was worth a try. When I got to her house, I hesitated, standing outside in the dark, wondering if I was making a mistake. But before I could talk myself out of it, I knocked on the door, and after a moment, Sam opened it. Her eyes went wide when she saw me standing there, shivering and clutching my bag. Maya, are you okay? She asked, pulling me inside and wrapping a blanket around my shoulders before I could even answer. I nodded, trying to hold back tears. I didn't know where else to go. I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. It felt like if I said anything more, I'd completely fall apart. Sam didn't ask any questions. She just led me to the couch, sat beside me, and let me cry while she rubbed my back, offering a quiet kind of comfort that I hadn't felt in a long time. When I finally calmed down, she gave me a look that was equal parts concern and determination. You're staying here tonight, she said firmly. No arguments. That night was the first time in months that I slept without the weight of Karen's presence hovering over me. It wasn't until the morning that I allowed myself to think about what I was going to do next. Sam's parents were kind and understanding. They didn't ask too many questions, just offered me breakfast and said I could stay as long as I needed. But I knew I couldn't stay with them forever. They had their own lives, and I didn't want to burden them. After a few days, I started looking for ways to make it on my own. It wasn't easy. I had to skip school to visit shelters and community centers, hoping someone would be able to help me find a more permanent solution. After a few dead ends, I met with a social worker who specialized in helping young people in situations like mine. She was calm and patient, listening to my story without judgment, and told me she'd help me find a place to stay. She explained that there were programs to support teens going through rough patches, and that with a little time, I could get back on my feet. It was the first real glimmer of hope I'd felt since Karen had kicked me out. Within a week, I'd been placed in a temporary housing program for young people. It wasn't fancy by any means, but it was safe and it was mine. I could breathe again, knowing I had somewhere to go each night. I even found a part time job at a small coffee shop near the housing center. The pay wasn't great, but it was something, and it made me feel like I was finally gaining some control over my life. Balancing work and school was exhausting, but I threw myself into it. School had always been my escape, and now it became my purpose. I had no family left to count on, no home to go back to, but I could at least build something for myself. I spent every free moment studying, determined to make something out of the mess my life had become. Over time, things started to feel manageable. I'd made a few friends at the housing center, people who understood what it was like to be left on your own. We'd stay up late sometimes, talking about our plans for the future, about getting out of this place and making lives we could be proud of. It wasn't the family I'd lost, but it was something, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a little less alone. School became more than just an escape. It was my chance to prove that Karen hadn't broken me. I pushed myself harder than ever, determined to get the grades I'd need to go to college. It was exhausting, working late shifts and then staying up to study, but every A I got felt like a victory. Each grade was a small piece of proof that I was still standing, still fighting. Months passed, and I found out that I'd won a small scholarship to a local college. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough to make college seem like a real possibility. I couldn't believe it. After everything Karen had put me through, I was still moving forward, still chasing my dreams. Then one day, out of nowhere, I got a call from my dad. It was surreal, hearing his voice after all this time. He sounded different, older, tired in a way I hadn't heard before. I gripped the phone tightly, bracing myself for whatever he was going to say. Maya, I know it's been a while, he began, his voice shaky. But we need your help. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I asked, barely able to keep the bitterness out of my voice. There was a long pause, and I could hear him take a deep breath. It's Karen, he said finally. We're going through some hard times. Financially, things have been tough since the baby came. I clenched my jaw, feeling a surge of anger. After everything they'd put me through, after they'd thrown me out like I was nothing, he had the nerve to ask me for help. I couldn't believe it. Dad, I said slowly, struggling to keep my voice steady. You kicked me out. Karen made it clear she didn't want me in the family. And now you're calling to ask me for help. He was silent for a moment, and then he sighed. I know, Maya. I know. And I'm sorry. But we're in a tough spot, and I thought maybe you could find it in your heart to help us out. I wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what I thought of his apology, but instead, I just took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. I didn't owe them anything, not after what they'd done to me. But I realized something in that moment. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need their approval, or their love, or even their apology. I'd built a life without them. I'd found people who cared about me, who believed in me, even if they weren't related to me. And I'd done it all on my own, without anyone's help. I can't help you, Dad, I said quietly. I've moved on. I have my own life now. He tried to say something else, some weak plea, but I hung up before he could finish. I stared at the phone for a long moment, feeling a strange sense of closure. I wasn't their victim anymore. I was free. And as I looked around at my tiny room, filled with my books, my sketches, my little pieces of a life I'd built for myself, I knew I was going to be okay. After I hung up the phone, I sat in silence, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. My father, who had stood by while Karen threw me out, had the audacity to ask me for help. He wanted me to somehow forget the years of hurt and betrayal, to swoop in and save them from the mess they'd made of their lives. The weight of their desperation settled on me for a moment, but then something shifted inside me. I felt a strange, unexpected lightness. This was the closure I didn't know I'd been waiting for. They had finally seen me as something useful. Too late, of course, but it didn't matter anymore. They'd spent years breaking me down, but now I was the one standing, whole, while they crumbled. The days after that call felt different. I walked around with my head held a little higher, my steps more confident. I'd faced the worst they could throw at me and still found a way to rebuild my life. They had no power over me anymore, and I wasn't going to let their broken lives pull me back into their mess. I threw myself into work, taking on extra shifts at the coffee shop and saving every penny I could. I kept my scholarship information close, and every time I looked at it, it felt like a ticket to freedom. My life wasn't perfect by any means. I still had to juggle school, work, and the challenges of living in a shared housing center. There were days when the exhaustion crept up on me, and I'd sit on my bed, too tired to even think. But even on the worst days, I knew I was doing this for myself. Every late shift, every study session was a step toward the future I was building on my own terms. About a month after my dad's call, my boss at the coffee shop, Sarah, pulled me aside after a shift. "Hey, Maya, I just wanted to tell you I've noticed how hard you've been working," she said, her voice warm and kind. "You've been handling a lot and you've never missed a shift. We could use someone like you here full time. Have you thought about taking on a few more responsibilities?" Her words caught me off guard. I'd been working so hard, keeping my head down and just trying to survive, that I hadn't expected anyone to notice. The idea of more hours and more pay was tempting, especially with college on the horizon. "I'd love to," I replied, smiling. "Thank you so much, Sarah. This really means a lot to me." With the extra hours, I was able to save even more, slowly building a cushion for myself. I'd grown close to some of my coworkers, and a few of them even invited me out after work sometimes. It felt strange to be included, to have people who wanted me around without any strings attached. For the first time, I had a taste of what it was like to belong. One evening after closing, Sarah invited a few of us over to her place. We sat around her kitchen table, talking and laughing, sharing stories from our lives. When it was my turn, I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something in me wanted to share. I told them about Karen, about the years of isolation and mistreatment, about how I'd been kicked out. I kept it brief, not wanting to dwell on the painful parts, but as I spoke, I could feel the weight of it lifting. My coworkers listened with empathy, nodding along, and when I finished, one of them, a girl named Jess, reached over and squeezed my hand. "Wow, Maya," she said softly, "you're one of the strongest people I know. Seriously." Her words made me pause, a warmth filling me that I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I'd seen myself as weak, as someone who wasn't worth fighting for. But sitting there, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, I realized that I'd become strong. I had survived. As the months rolled on, I found myself thinking less and less about Karen and my dad. My life was busy, filled with work, classes, and new friends. I'd applied to the local college, using my scholarship as a foundation, and I was determined to make it work, even if it meant working long hours on top of studying. I didn't mind. Every late night was worth it, knowing that I was carving out a future for myself. Then one evening, I got a letter from the college admissions office. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting another rejection, another roadblock. But as I scanned the words, I felt a surge of relief and disbelief all at once. I'd been accepted. I was going to college. The day I received my acceptance letter, I walked around in a daze, unable to stop smiling. This was my chance, my way out of the shadow of my past. I was finally free. The news spread quickly among my friends and coworkers. Sarah threw a small celebration for me at the coffee shop. decorating the break room with balloons and streamers. My coworkers hugged me, congratulating me, telling me how proud they were. Their joy felt genuine, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. The night after the celebration, as I lay in bed, my thoughts drifted back to my dad and Karen. I knew I'd never see them again, that they were part of a life I'd left behind. I didn't need them anymore, didn't need their approval or their support. I'd found my own family, a community of people who cared about me, who saw me for who I was and valued me. And as I closed my eyes, a sense of peace washed over me. I was ready for whatever came next, knowing that I'd built this life with my own hands, brick by brick. I had survived, I had overcome, and now I was moving forward on my terms for the first time in my life. Starting college felt like stepping into a new world, a world I dreamed of but hadn't dared to believe could really be mine. I remember my first day vividly, the buzz of energy on campus, the crowded hallways, the sound of students chatting as they moved between classes. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. After so many years of feeling confined, invisible, and small, I was finally somewhere that felt open, welcoming, and full of possibility. I was free to be whoever I wanted. I threw myself into my classes, determined to make the most of this opportunity. College wasn't just about getting a degree for me. It was a chance to start over, to prove that I could make something of myself despite everything I'd been through. I spent hours in the library, studying late into the night, filling notebook after notebook with ideas and plans for the future. Every time I sat down to study, I thought about all the times Karen had told me I wasn't good enough, that I'd never amount to anything. Each completed assignment felt like defiance, a quiet rebellion against her words. It didn't take long for me to start making friends in my classes. I found a group of people who were passionate about the same things I was: literature, art, social justice, and we'd spend hours debating topics, sharing ideas, and encouraging each other. They were the kind of friends I'd always wanted, people who accepted me for who I was, who respected my opinions, and who never made me feel like I didn't belong. One evening, after a long study session with my friends, I found myself walking back to my dorm with a girl named Emily. She was quiet, thoughtful, with a kindness that reminded me of Sam, the friend who'd taken me in when I'd had nowhere else to go. As we walked, she glanced over at me and asked, "Maya, do you ever think about your family? Like what they'd think if they saw you now?" Her question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I tried not to think about them. I'd spent so much time distancing myself from that life, pushing those memories into a box in the back of my mind, that I didn't want to open it now. But Emily's question lingered, and as we reached my dorm, I found myself saying, sometimes, "But I don't need them to be proud of me. I'm proud of myself." She smiled, and I realized that was the first time I'd admitted it out loud. I really was proud of myself. I'd come so far, from those lonely days in Karen's house to building a life of my own. I didn't need anyone's validation anymore. I was standing on my own 2 feet. College life continued, and with each passing month, I felt myself growing stronger, more confident. I started taking on leadership roles in student organizations, speaking up in class, sharing my story with people who could relate. My past no longer felt like a burden I had to carry. Instead, it became a part of me, a reminder of how far I'd come. My life was finally my own, free from the weight of Karen's cruelty and my dad's indifference. Then one afternoon, I got an email from a social worker at the housing center where I'd stayed after Karen kicked me out. I hadn't heard from them in over a year, so I was surprised to see their name pop up in my inbox. The email was brief, but it stopped me in my tracks. It read, "Hi Maya, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to let you know that Karen has been reaching out to us. She's been looking for ways to contact you, saying she's in need of help. Just wanted to pass this along in case you wanted to respond. Let us know if you need anything." I stared at the email, feeling a wave of emotions crash over me. After all this time, Karen was reaching out to me? It didn't make sense. What kind of help could she possibly need from me? I considered deleting the email and ignoring it altogether, but a part of me was curious. I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt knowing that she was the one who needed me now. I had power in this situation, something I never had when I lived under her roof. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I should do. Old memories began to resurface, uninvited. Karen's cruel comments, the countless chores, the isolation, and finally, the moment she'd thrown me out. The anger I thought I'd let go of bubbled up again, but it was mixed with something else, a strange sense of pity. I knew how hard life could be, and if she was desperate enough to reach out to me, then maybe she was finally getting a taste of what she'd put me through. The next day, I emailed the social worker back, asking if they could pass along my phone number to Karen. Part of me didn't want to open this door, but another part of me needed to know why she'd come looking for me after everything she'd done. It didn't take long for her to call. Her voice on the phone was a far cry from the Karen I remembered. She sounded tired, almost frail, her words stumbling over each other in a way that was unrecognizable. Maya, it's Karen, she started, and I could hear her struggling to hold herself together. I I know I don't have the right to ask, but things have been really hard. Your father and I, oh, we need some help. I waited, letting her words hang in the silence, feeling this strange calmness wash over me. This was the same woman who'd once looked at me with cold disdain, who had made my life a living nightmare. And now, she was the one asking for help. What kind of help? I asked, my voice steady and controlled. I wanted to hear her say it. She hesitated, her voice cracking. We've lost the house, and your father's been ill. The medical bills were drowning in debt. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I just didn't know where else to turn. The pity I'd felt the night before faded, replaced by a wave of bitterness. She had no idea what it felt like to be abandoned, to be left alone with no one to turn to. She'd never been through what she'd put me through. And now she wanted my help. Karen, I said slowly, letting each word sink in, you threw me out when I had nothing. You treated me like I was a burden, like I was less than nothing. And now you expect me to help you? I could hear her struggling to respond, her breath shallow and panicked. I know, Maya. I know. And I'm sorry. I truly am. I just, I made a lot of mistakes. But please, if there's any kindness left in your heart. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to hang up, to let her deal with the mess she'd created. But another part of me realized something important. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to acknowledge the pain she'd caused me because I'd already moved past it. I was stronger than she'd ever given me credit for, stronger than she'd ever know. I hope you find the help you need, I said finally, my voice calm. But I can't be that person for you. I've built my own life now. I don't owe you anything. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, plead, try to manipulate me like she always had. But instead, I heard a soft, broken whisper. I understand. Goodbye, Maya. I hung up, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The chapter with Karen and my dad was finally, truly over. I was free. That night, as I sat at my desk, surrounded by my books and notes, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I'd been through hell and back, but I'd come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more certain of who I was. I didn't need their approval, their love, or their validation. I'd found all of that in myself. I knew my future was bright, and it was mine to shape however I wanted. And with every step forward, I was leaving the shadows of my past behind, finally ready to embrace the life I'd fought so hard to build. Months passed after that final conversation with Karen, and I settled into my life with a renewed sense of purpose. I threw myself even harder into my studies, my work, and the friendships I was building. The strange thing about true freedom was how quiet it felt, like I could finally breathe without that familiar weight pressing down on me. There were no more dark clouds of Karen's judgment hanging over me, no more feelings of rejection lurking in my mind. I was truly on my own, and for once, I liked it that way. College was more than I had ever dreamed it could be. The campus felt like a world of possibilities, each class filling my mind with ideas and questions I'd never thought to ask. I'd even started participating in class discussions, something I never would have done back in high school when I was afraid of being noticed. Now, my voice was steady, strong. I'd found something to say, and I wanted people to hear it. Around this time, I joined a campus group that focused on helping young people who had been through tough family situations. The group met once a week, and I started sharing my story little by little, realizing how much I'd kept bottled up. The other members listened, nodding along, sharing their own experiences of broken homes, toxic families, and the struggles of finding stability. For the first time, I felt like my story was more than just a painful memory. It was a way to connect with others, to help them see that they weren't alone. One day after one of these meetings, I was talking with one of the other group members, a girl named Rachel, who had been through her own share of challenges. We were sitting on the campus lawn, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. You know, Maya, Rachel said, looking at me with a thoughtful expression, you should think about speaking at one of our campus events. Your story could really make a difference. The idea caught me off guard. I never thought of myself as someone who could inspire others. I'd just been trying to survive, to piece my life back together. But as I looked around at the students passing by, I realized that maybe Rachel was right. If my story could help even one person feel less alone, maybe it was worth telling. A few weeks later, I found myself standing on a small stage at a campus event, staring out at a crowd of students. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, but I took a deep breath and started talking. I told them about Karen, about the years of feeling worthless, the day she'd thrown me out, and the journey I'd taken to get here. I could see people's faces changing as I spoke, nodding along, some even tearing up. By the time I finished, the room was filled with applause, and for the first time, I felt a deep sense of pride, not just in surviving, but in sharing my story. After that speech, things started changing in ways I hadn't expected. People began approaching me on campus, telling me how much my story had resonated with them, how they'd gone through similar situations. I realized that I wasn't just healing myself. I was becoming part of a community of people who had faced hardships and were determined to move forward. My confidence grew, both academically and personally. I began looking for ways to give back, volunteering at a local youth center that helped teens dealing with family issues. I saw parts of my younger self in many of them, lost, uncertain, but with a spark of resilience just waiting to be ignited. I wanted them to see that they could make it through, that they could build a life beyond the pain and the struggle. One evening, as I was walking back from the youth center, I paused to watch the sunset over the campus, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold. I thought about how far I'd come, how different my life looked now compared to those dark days with Karen. It struck me that I was finally at peace with my past. I'd found a way to turn my pain into something meaningful, something that could help others. The shadows of my past no longer haunted me. They were simply memories, parts of a story that had brought me to this point. A few months later, as I finished my second year of college, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from my father. I hadn't heard from him since that last call with Karen, and for a moment, I debated whether or not to open it. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to leave that chapter of my life completely behind. But another part of me was curious, wondering what he could possibly have to say after everything that had happened. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter, my hands trembling slightly. His handwriting was messy, the words smudged in places, as if he'd hesitated or rewritten parts of it. Dear Maya, it began, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not sure I even deserve a response. But I wanted to reach out to let you know that I think about you every day. I regret everything that happened, and I know I failed you in ways that no father should. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. The letter went on, filled with words of regret and apology, things I'd once longed to hear but had given up on. He told me about how things had fallen apart with Karen, about the mistakes he'd made, the ways he'd let me down. He said he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but he hoped that one day, maybe, we could find a way to rebuild what he'd broken. As I read the letter, I felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. This was the apology I'd never expected to get, the acknowledgement of my pain that I'd stopped hoping for. I knew I didn't need his forgiveness to move on. I'd already done that. But there was something healing about his words, about knowing that he understood. Even if it was too late, I folded the letter and tucked it away in my drawer, deciding to think on it. I didn't know if I'd ever respond or if I even wanted to open that door again. But I felt a quiet sense of closure, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, some things could be left in the past with forgiveness, even if they could never be forgotten. Over the summer, I kept busy with work and volunteering, preparing for my junior year. Life felt steady, filled with purpose, and I finally felt like I was standing firmly on my own 2 feet. My friends became my family, and the youth center became a place where I could channel my experiences into something meaningful. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving. One evening, as I was leaving the youth center, one of the teens I'd been working with, a girl named Tessa, stopped me at the door. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the sleeves of her jacket. "Hey, Maya," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I don't know if I would have made it through this year without you." Her words took me by surprise, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "You're stronger than you know, Tessa," I replied, smiling. "You don't need me. You've had it in you all along." She smiled back, and in that moment, I realized that I'd come full circle. The girl who had once been thrown out, who had struggled to survive, had become someone others could lean on. My pain had transformed into strength, my loneliness into connection, my anger into compassion. As I walked home that night, the sky darkening above me, I felt a profound sense of peace. My journey had been filled with heartache, loss, and struggle, but it had led me here to a life filled with purpose and meaning. I no longer needed Karen or my father's validation because I'd found something far more valuable, my own sense of worth. I knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but I was ready to face them. I was no longer the girl who had been thrown away. I was a survivor, a fighter, and someone who had turned her darkest days into light. And as I looked up at the stars, I felt a quiet, unshakable certainty that I was finally, truly free.